I think it's really critical for people to realize that being an ally is a journey. It's a journey that we probably will never end if we are committed to this. And we will never end because we as allies can't possibly understand or anticipate or realize the extent of the experience that people from underrepresented groups have in our companies and our industries.
Free to Grow in Forestry, a podcast working to move forestry forward. The Canadian Institute of Forestry and the Centre for Social Intelligence proudly present the Free to Grow in Forestry podcast. The Free to Grow in Forestry initiative was launched to create a diverse and inclusive workplace culture where all Canadians feel they belong. We believe strongly that inclusive cultures not only strengthen our Canadian forest sector economy, but also create resilient and healthy communities. This podcast seeks out guests from all aspects of the forest sector, from the C-suite to every part of the underrepresented communities, to open up the dialogue on issues of concern and points of view so that everyone has greater knowledge and understanding of each other. By unearthing these discussions, we hope to stimulate greater empathy and respect for all people, opening up the forest sector to be more welcoming and accepting of everyone. For our fourth episode, we are pleased to be joined by our host, Kelly Cooper, founder and CEO of the Centre for Social Intelligence, and our guest, Karen Catlin, who is a leadership coach, speaker, author, and advocate for inclusive workplaces. Karen dives into more detail on how we can work to become better allies for underrepresented groups through our everyday actions and create diverse and engaging environments. This session was recorded live on August 9th, 2021.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Free to Grow in Forestry podcast. My name is Kelly Cooper, and I will be your host. The purpose of this podcast series is to raise awareness about how to strengthen the workplace culture in the forest sector through increasing the number of underrepresented groups, which includes all genders, races, disabilities, or heritage, to create acceptance of all Canadians into the forest sector. I talk with people from all of these different perspectives to explain their point of view, to create greater understanding and empathy, and to give insights on how to engage them more fully. Breaking down misperceptions and commonly held myths allows the current workforce to reflect and engage in new ways with all Canadians that not only reduces any social conflicts, but also increases awareness about how there are economic gains to be had by having a more diverse workforce. I also speak with experts who are immersed every day in various aspects of integrating diversity and inclusion in the workplace so we can gain new insights about how to go about shifting a workplace culture more effectively. And today I am joined with Karen Catlin, author of Better Allies, Everyday Actions to Create Inclusive, Engaging Workplaces. And we will be talking about the importance of being an ally for underrepresented groups and how to go about it effectively. Karen, good morning, and thanks for being with us today.
Good morning, Kelly. The pleasure is all mine.
So Karen, how about we start with you telling us a bit about your backstory of how you became an advocate for inclusive workplaces and came to write Better Allies?
Well, Kelly, first of all, I never started out to write a book. That was not part of my game plan at all. I was working in tech. In fact, I worked in tech for about 25 years. I'm based in Silicon Valley. That's where so much of tech happens. And I started out as an engineer, writing code for a living. And then over time, I moved into leadership roles. And most recently, I was a vice president of engineering at Adobe. And during that 25 years, I noticed a decline happening in gender diversity in the software engineering field. So as the most senior woman in engineering at Adobe, I decided I had a role to play to support women across the company. So I started our employee resource group for women. I started mentoring a lot of women and just kind of being that advocate for gender diversity, like making sure we had representation in various meetings and so forth. And Kelly, over time, I loved doing that work, kind of a little bit more than my VP of engineering work. And so I decided I wanted to do that full time, support women in my industry. So this goes back now about 9 years. I started my own leadership coaching practice for women working in tech. And I love leadership coaching. I still do a lot of that today as part of my business. But I soon realized I had a problem with this new leadership coaching practice I had created. And the problem I was facing is that I could help women grow their leadership skills and do a really good job at that, see them, grow all these new skills. But the problem they were facing wasn't with how they were showing up to work every day. The problem they were facing is that their tech companies, where they were working, all of them, the closer you got to the C-suite, to the CEO, just the maler and paler it got. And so while there might have been good representation at the entry level, it degraded as you moved up through the ranks. So that's when I realized, and first of all, I should say, for anyone who's listening who's male and or pale, I am white myself, this is not anything about shaming or blaming anyone for this. It's more just that's what the demographics revealed. And those demographics, of course, revealed also that these companies are not meritocracies that I think most people hope that they are working for. Meritocracies where you get ahead on your merit, on the impact of your work and so forth, because white men were getting ahead at a faster pace than the women and other people from underrepresented groups. So when I realized that was the dynamic I had to really get over to help my clients, I was like, okay, I'm going to make all of tech more inclusive. And you can laugh at me, I know, because here I am, one person, that's a pretty lofty goal, but I was determined and probably a little naive, and that's okay. Now, the first thing you do these days when you want to change the world is you start a Twitter handle, right? So this goes back almost 6 years now. In 2014, I started the Twitter handle @BetterAllies to share what I saw were simple, everyday actions people could take to be more inclusive to their coworkers who are from underrepresented groups. And while my initial focus was women, I quickly expanded to cover people from all genders, all sexual orientations and identities, races, ethnicities, age, abilities, all aspects of being underrepresented. Okay, I'm getting to the end of my story, so I'll wrap this up now. I'm tweeting, sharing things I come across that could be these everyday actions people could take. And I started getting speaking engagements. Can you come speak at our conference? Can you come speak at our company and share this whole approach of everyday actions to be more inclusive? And so I started speaking, and every time that I gave a talk during the Q&A, someone would say, "Hey, Karen, this was wonderful, but we want more. Do you have a book?" And Kelly, for a few years, I was like, "Oh, no book. No, I don't have a book. No book yet. Nope, no book. Sorry, no book." But of course, that was my call to action that I really had to write my book. So I published Better Allies, the book, about 2.5 years ago in early 2019. And in 2021, I came out with a second edition. Yeah. So there's the backstory.
That's fantastic. That's really great. How about you start with positioning this talk for our listeners and explain what an ally is? Can you and give us some examples?
Sure. So an ally is someone who uses their position of privilege, and I'll unpack that a little bit, but uses their position of privilege to advocate, sponsor, support, open a career door, be more inclusive of someone who doesn't have all the privilege we might have as an ally. So what is privilege? Let's unpack that. Privilege is really just a set of unearned benefits we get because of some social group that we're a part of. Social group because of our gender, our race, ethnicity, or something else, our standing within an organization, our credibility, for example. In my book, and it's also a free PDF download on my website, betterallies.com, if anyone wants to see it, but there's a list of 50 ways you might have privilege in the workplace to help unpack that. It's a little bit more, can be nuanced at times in terms of if you and I are both women, Kelly, and we, even though we might be in male dominated fields, we still have privilege because we are white, perhaps. And I mean, not perhaps, but we are white. And so that gives us privilege. But we might also have privilege because of we have enough money in the bank, for example, that allows us to take risks with our careers. And speak up or sign up for some stretch assignment that's risky within our organization that allows us to just have that confidence of even if I lose my job, I have enough money in the bank to support myself and my family for and months or whatever that might look like. Here in the States where I am, privilege also means that you have U.S. citizenship status, which means that you're not reliant on your employer for a visa to stay in this country. There's so many ways of privilege showing up in the workplace. And so I encourage people, like, explore your privilege, understand the privilege you have, and that not everyone has the same privilege as you. And that can then allow you to be an ally. So you also asked, what are some examples of being an ally? And I want to make it clear, like, there are so many ways allies can show up. I think I'll give 2 examples just to emphasize how I see these as being kind of easy things that people can weave into their day-to-day. One, I remember soon after I had joined Adobe, I was in a large engineering leadership meeting, and I heard my boss, who was a senior vice president at the company, highly respected man, I heard him say, well, what I learned from Karen Catlin is the following. And he went on to summarize something I had shared with him in a one-on-one, probably the previous week. But the fact that he made a note of saying he had learned something from me, who was more junior to him, was a new hire at the company, who was kind of an unknown. First of all, Kelly, you can imagine he made me feel great in the moment, right?
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. But he also, I think, helped me build credibility with all my new peers. And what that credibility allows someone to do is then start navigating the workplace in a different way. So as I needed to reach out and get support for initiatives, or at times maybe haggle over some budget or resources or whatever, like, I had more credibility going into those meetings. And I think it made a difference.
For sure. He immediately sponsored you, validated you, gave you credibility in an instant.
In an instant.
It's amazing. Simple thing. It's a simple gesture, but it goes a long way, for sure.
Right. So I encourage people who are thinking about how they can be allies is look to how you can endorse someone publicly. And that example of I learned from Karen Catlin the following is one example of endorsing someone publicly, but it could be other things in your workplace culture, in your industry, in your community that make sense for what the dynamics are like, what the culture's like. So I said I'd give 2 examples. Let me go on to my second example of an ally. There's so many, it's hard to choose from, but I'm going to share one example of someone who was attending a conference for his company. And he was on a flight to the city where the conference was being held. And he saw one of his coworkers, a woman, on the same flight. And he said, going to the conference, would you like to share a taxi to the hotel when we land? And she replied, well, that'd be great, except I'm not staying at the conference hotel. I'm staying across town. And he said, what's up with that? And she said, well, I got approval at the last minute. There weren't any rooms left at the conference hotel. You've probably been there yourself. And so I had to book across town. So that's going on. And his reaction was like, oh, poor thing, because he was thinking about all of the additional expense reporting she would have to do when they got back in terms of the taxi rides back and forth or the rideshare rides, whatever she was going to do. He was thinking additional paperwork, like, poor thing. Like, I'm sorry to hear about all that additional paperwork you're going to have to do. And she looks at him and she's like, well, no, that's not what I'm concerned about. What I'm concerned about is that twice a day, I'm putting my personal safety at risk by getting into a stranger's vehicle and having to go to the conference and then get back to my hotel. I've had bad experiences in the past, and this is weighing on me. Like, this is the problem. I could care less about the paperwork. Well, of course, he admitted this to me. This is a man I was talking to. He admitted this to me. He's like, I'd never thought about personal safety concerns navigating a city for a conference. So once he realized that and realized he had privilege as a man, that he didn't have to worry about all of that, he, of course, offered to her, would you like to switch hotel rooms? I'll take the one across town. You take the one in the hotel where the conference is happening. So that's a great ally move. But then he took it a step further, Kelly, and this is what I love. He also then advocated for that conference in the future to prioritize rooms at the venue for women to be able to be in a safer environment. So it's a great example, and I write about this in my book, of knights versus allies. In the moment, he was a knight in shining armor, helping this damsel in distress from sort of like, this concern she has. He stood up and he gave up his slot at the conference venue. But then he looked for a systemic change that could make it better for all women. And I love that story because of that additional step he took.
Yeah, that's a great story. Yeah, and it makes me think as well about people with disabilities, which is an often unspoken discussion in the underrepresented, conversation. And clearly, that would be something to advocate for or make a note of, so people have greater awareness.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. So I understand you have a weekly newsletter, and you often write about mistakes you've made on your own journey to being a better ally. It's hard for most of us to admit when we're wrong, but why do you do this? What is it about this that has become effective?
Yeah, so I do write this weekly newsletter. It's called 5 Ally Actions, and I send it out every Friday. And it's pretty much a roundup of what I've learned during the week, what news has come out, new research on the topic of inclusion and diversity. But I also share mistakes I've made. And I share these mistakes, and I'll give an example or two, but I share these mistakes because I think it's really critical for people to realize that being an ally is a journey. It's a journey that we probably will never end if we are committed to this. And we will never end because we as allies can't possibly understand or anticipate or realize the extent of the experience that people from underrepresented groups have in our companies, in our industries. So it's, and plus we're humans and we're bound to make mistakes. And the important thing, I think, a mindset of any ally is it's better to get it wrong than to do nothing. Okay. Because people from underrepresented groups need us to be trying things out, to be standing up, to be pushing back, to be advocating, sponsoring, all of those words. We need to try, even though we might get it wrong. We might use the wrong language. We might make a mistake along the way, but we can't not do it. We can't opt out from this conversation, from this responsibility. So I want to make sure people are comfortable making mistakes. And so I think a great way to do that is to share when I make mistakes myself. So let me give you an example of one that I was talking to someone recently who reads my newsletter, and he pointed out to me how helpful this mistake was to him. So what was going on? In the United States, we have I would call it a holiday, even though it's not necessarily something to really celebrate, but it's called Juneteenth, and it's the 19th of June. And it has been widely recognized by the Black community here as the day that people in Texas, which was sort of an outpost of the rest of the country at that time, when they first heard about the end of slavery. And I wrote about this, that the slaves in Texas heard about this date, Juneteenth, June 19th, and they heard about their emancipation. And so I was writing about this. Well, I heard from newsletter subscribers, and people emailed me, which I do appreciate so much. Someone wrote to me saying it's better, you shouldn't talk about people as slaves because that focuses on them as that is their only identity. The more contemporary and appropriate way to talk about this is the formerly enslaved people of Texas, for example, so that it doesn't become that that's their only identity, that they were slaves, but they were formerly enslaved, for example. And after this was pointed out, I started seeing newspaper reporters doing the same thing. This is the formerly enslaved people. And so I write that in my next week's newsletter to show that I got this feedback, that I learned from it, that I wish I had paid attention to it before, but I hadn't. But once you know something, you can do better, right? So I shared that. Now, just last week, I was talking to someone who gets my newsletter, and he thanked me. He's like, I remember back in June when you wrote that, and I was just about to go into an all-hands meeting where we were talking about Juneteenth. And I was going to call people slaves instead of the formerly enslaved people. I hadn't known about that, but because of your newsletter, because you shared what you learned, I was able to apply your learning to my all hands, and I think it was more effective as a result. So he was thanking me. Of course, I only need one of those examples to make all the difference in the world, Kelly. And I of course, I thrive on positive reinforcement. So anyway, so I'm going to keep doing that. I'm going to keep sharing mistakes I've made on this journey so other people can learn and hopefully get comfortable with making mistakes too.
Yeah, and a lot of this is about knowing the right language, right? To share and how to explain things. And what do you say though to people? So you're talking more to the C-suite folks and getting this positive reinforcement back on thank yous and so forth. But what about everyday workers who, like in our forest sector here, we have a lot of people who are out in the field. They're very much almost like a club in a way. Do you know what I mean? Like they have a different kind of way of being out in the bush, as they say here. What do you say to them who are not as interested, frankly, in onboarding any of these underrepresented groups?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, the example I just gave was someone who was a senior leader, C-suite type person. But I also hear from people who are individual contributors in their companies that they are reading my newsletter, reading my book, applying some things. They're not doing it all, and no one has to, but they're applying certain things that they are learning and step by step getting more inclusive, being more inclusive. So I want to emphasize that I think my message is applicable for people at all levels and all levels and roles in an organization. But let's talk about the naysayers. It sounds like, the people who are like, this isn't my job to do this. I've been hired to do this work, not to like be so welcoming of other people and everything. And I get it. So part of me, and this is my mindset, it's like, I know I'm not going to convince 100% of the people. There are always going to be those naysayers. And frankly, I don't have energy. I don't, if I can get to call it 50, 60, 70% of people out there in an organization who already care about this and they just don't know what to be doing, that's my focus. And I frankly don't have, I don't think I'll ever reach 100% of the people. So I want to acknowledge that. Yet, I love the approach, and I use this so much in my work, the approach of being curious, not furious. Curious about like if I were in the bush, is that what you called it, in the bush? If I were in the bush working side by side with one of those people and I just pointed out, it's like, let's hang up the homophobic jokes around the lunch table. Like, can we just stop? Like, if I said something like that, and they're like, when did you become so politically correct? Like, big deal. No one here is gay. I don't, I can say that joke, big deal. I'd start, and I'm already hearing it in my voice, I'd start to get a little furious with that person, like I'm inside my head. But instead, it's better to get curious. Get curious is like, why do you think it's so funny to make fun? Tell me more about the joke. Like, what's so funny about that joke you just made? I don't get it. Like, be curious about what they're saying, or be curious about their mindset of, it sounds like you really don't think women should be working on this site. Like, tell me more about why you feel that way. And not to like trap them or be more clever than them to get them to say something they wish they regretted, but really to approach this from a mindset of, I want to be curious about where they're coming from. And that might help lead you then to having a better conversation about this, I don't know. I just think it's this curious, not furious kind of a mindset is a fantastic one for allies.
I agree. I think being curious is a key piece to all of this. So what I'm taking away from you are two things. One, we talk to the leaders. The leaders onboard this way of being and thinking, and they cascade it down, right? That's the intent. The other is the individual and what you can start to do on a day-to-day basis. And it will be incremental. It's not like you're going to solve the curiosity gig for the moment, but you have started a conversation. You've started the momentum, let's say, toward a different way of looking at that underrepresented group, which I think is great.
And Kelly, and I'll add to what you said too, in that there are going to be called the alphas in any group. The alphas are the people who are just highly respected in any small group, work group. It could be, on a work site or in an organization. And when those alphas start acting in a certain way, the people around them mimic them. So the alphas in any work group, and it could be out in the bush, for example, if they start being more inclusive, they can start a ripple effect of
Absolutely. It's all that role modeling, right? It's just role modeling, essentially.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring in something from your book now before I miss the opportunity. And I think it reflects on what we've been just talking about, but it's the idea you had in your book about a bingo card. Can you explain that for the listeners? Because I think it's quite effective and something we can consider doing here in the forest sector.
Okay, sure. So the bingo card, and by the way, it's also on my website. People, if they don't want to buy my book, they can check it out at betterallies.com. But in 2014, I was remotely attending a conference called the Grace Hopper Celebration of Women in Computing. And it's the largest worldwide conference for women in computer science and software engineering. And they had a male allies panel. And this was right at the beginning. I had not yet started my Twitter handle. I was just starting to realize I need to make tech workplaces more inclusive. And there was this male allies panel. So I started paying attention to what was going on. And long story short, there were women who were upset that men were taking valuable stage time away from women at this women's conference to talk about how great they were about being allies. And frankly, their companies didn't have that great a track record for being inclusive of women. Mm-hmm. So there were some women who were upset about this panel, and they created a bingo card of all the phrases they expected these men, these male allies, to share that would show how far they still had to go to be inclusive. And they printed out this bingo card and handed it out to people as they entered the room at the conference. And sure enough, you can just imagine what happened. About halfway through this panel of male allies, some woman shouted out bingo, and the room exploded, right, in laughter. Well, to their credit, the men on stage realized through conversation what was happening, and they offered to hold a reverse panel the next day, which meant that they would be on stage listening and having people in the audience share their experience so that they could learn from it. So hats off to them. But when I heard about that bingo card, I was like, wait a second. We really need to have the reverse of that bingo card. We need to have the bingo card of all the phrases we want men to be saying in support of women at their companies.
Yeah, I thought that was excellent. Yeah.
And so I floated this idea with a few people I knew in this field, a friend who works at Stanford, doing gender research, and a few other people, and they're like, do it. And so I collaborated with another woman in tech. Her name's Kate Houston, and we came up with the aspirational version of that bingo card. And then we published it in the Daily Beast. We wrote an article about it. Another person got wind of it. Her name's Kate Rotondo, and she's a graphic designer as well as a software engineer. And so she created a beautiful version of it for us. Ours was just a very basic text version. And then that catalyzed, like, oh my gosh, we can't just write about this once. These bingo card ideas need to be shared with the world. Mm-hmm. And they became my initial tweets for the Better Allies Twitter handle.
I love it. Yeah, I'm definitely going to onboard that with the forest sector. I got to check
awesome.
that out.
And Kelly, Kate and I wanted to make sure that this could be used by other sectors beyond software engineering. So we've open sourced it. It is available to anyone through a Creative Commons license, which means you can copy it and make your own version. You can change it, tweak it, or even just change the colors if it matches your professional organization, for example.
That's wonderful.
So I highly encourage people to check it out.
Yeah, for sure. I'm definitely doing that. So what you say here about the ally journey, Karen, is really critical, I think, because it's not just allies as men, but allies as women. And recently I've written a report for the Free to Grow in Forestry initiative that people can find on the Free to Grow in Forestry website. And it's called Getting into Team, Leveraging Power and Privilege. And in that, I talk about the ally journey spectrum. And it starts with, it's basically a 9-step process that people go through as an ally. And it starts with, I have a role to play. And it goes through to acknowledging the old me and then giving reflection on the thoughts of that. And then accepting a new way of being and pledging a commitment toward that new way of being, onboarding that new thinking, operating those actions with confidence, and then becoming a role model, and then essentially a lifetime advocate. And so by going through each one of those steps, people are walking the ally journey toward what we're asking people to do, which is really to be accepting of all Canadians in the forest sector.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I have one more question for you before we wrap up today. And that is really about knowing what you think things are like now versus when you started. So would you say things are better today on this topic than when you started, 8, 9 years ago?
Yeah. And really, the inclusive work was about 5 years ago or 6 years ago I started. Oh my gosh, 2014. Well, at any rate, it doesn't matter. When I started, the conversation, to just simplify it and summarize it, the conversation was like, yeah, I'm a decent human being. Of course, I care about inclusion of the workplace. I just what am I supposed to do? I'm just one person. That was where the conversation started. What I'm hearing today and seeing is such an appetite for this work. And some of that, Kelly, I'll admit, and this is bittersweet to me, is that this was catalyzed by George Floyd being killed last summer by police in Minnesota. It was catalyzed because that became a time where people were like, oh my gosh, maybe I'd been paying attention to gender diversity, but now, oh my gosh, I had no idea about the Black experience in America and in other places around the world. I want to do something. So people started protesting, Black Lives Matter protests. People started donating money in record amounts, and people started looking internally and figuring out, what can I do differently in my community or in my organizations at work to be more inclusive of my Black colleagues? And that just catalyzed this appetite for, I want to know what I can do personally. And it is expanded beyond just supporting Black coworkers, of course, but building on the gender conversation that was already having, and now to be more inclusive of other underrepresented groups. I just feel like there's an appetite that just wasn't there before. And what's exciting to me is that organizations who have diversity and inclusion strategies, I'm hearing about organization after organization who have, multiple pillars to their strategy, which is, kind of probably a best practice to have multiple pillars. But in addition to all the other things they might be doing, an emerging pillar is allyship. They want to empower their employees to be more inclusive in every corner of their organization. And I'm very hopeful as a result that this is going to make a difference.
Yeah, well, that's excellent. Yeah, I find it striking too with the George Floyd being the lightning rod shift for people, because it's not like those situations hadn't happened before.
I know.
So I find that telling, and I'm glad it's happened. I'm not exactly sure why now versus prior not, but in any event, I'm glad to see it's happening.
I know. And I wish I had been working on this and being more inclusive myself a whole lot earlier in my lifetime, but here I am today doing what I can do, and I hope that other people feel the same way.
Yeah.
There's no time like the present to make some change.
Definitely. Well, thanks very much for your time today, Karen. I really appreciate all the insights you've shared. It's been great. And I think you've given us the website, but feel free to, are there other social media links that we could be following you on, or that you can tell our listeners about, so that we're sure to catch your newsletter and so forth?
Yes. So Better Allies on Twitter, kind of where it all started, as well as Instagram. And I also have a Medium channel where I publish all my newsletters in addition to emailing them out. So if people like to get email newsletters, they'll go to my website, betterallies.com, to sign up.
Great. Well, thanks very much again. And hopefully we'll see some new material from you. I'm not going to push you to write another book, but I can tell that there's ideas floating around that might take you to that option. And I'll look forward to staying in touch with you.
Thank you, Kelly. It was such a pleasure, and I'm glad our paths have crossed. We will be in touch, my friend.
Okay. Take care.
Gender, diversity, and inclusion are crucial to the advancement of a thriving and resilient forest sector. As we continue to grow and change, we all have a role to play in making our sector a place where everyone has the support they need to succeed and thrive. For more information on how you can take action and help make a difference, follow Free to Grow in Forestry on social media, or visit us at www.freetogrowinforestry.ca. And if you have a story you think should be heard about an experience you have had or what you'd like to see happen in the Canadian forest sector workforce, we'd love to hear from you. Please email us at freetogrowinforestry@cif-ifc.org. Together, we can move forestry forward.